Welcome to Badger Talks Quick Picks, which brings exciting happenings, resources, and talent from your UW flagship campus to the people of Wisconsin and beyond, demonstrating the power of the Wisconsin idea, one connection at a time.
Hi, I'm Lisa Cooper, professor of English and especially of medieval literature at UW-Madison. And today, I'm going to talk about the way that recipes, violence, texture, and literary character come together in interesting, surprising, and sometimes disturbing ways in later medieval England. On that note, a quick content advisory. This talk will touch on violence done to animals and people, as well as on medieval anti-Semitism. In the Middle Ages, making a meal, especially if it involved meat, always meant a necessary degree of violence. If the animal was wild, it needed to be hunted before it was killed and then butchered in order to be further prepared for the medieval table. Medieval recipes, as they have survived in 14th and 15th century recipe books, encode some of that violence in their language. Now, medieval people of every social class had a very varied diet, but in the upper echelons of society, those members who would have been using medieval recipe books, in those books, smoothness and softness appear to have been particular goals, as if in the era before blenders and food processors, the softness and smoothness connoted a certain degree of luxury. But to get to that kind of luxury, kitchen tools needed to be wielded almost as weapons with language to match. As one scholar has put it, this was transformative cooking, based on grinding and pounding ingredients to pulps of various consistencies. And in medieval recipe books, we find many violent verbs for the many cooking techniques that created those soft and smooth textures. One place that we can see that kind of language is, however, not in a recipe book, but rather in the language spoken by one of the pilgrims on Geoffrey Chaucer's pilgrimage to Canterbury in his poem, The Canterbury Tales. The pardoner, who is the corrupt preacher on the pilgrimage, gives a sermon on the vice of gluttony, and he condemns cooks for, as he says, stamping and straining and grinding as they turn substance into accident in the kitchen. And this language may seem a little hyperbolic, but recipe books show us that this was the kind of thing that was indeed taking place in medieval kitchens. The pardoner here also gestures towards that value of softness and of smoothness when he says that cooks knock the marrow out of hard bones because they cast nothing away that may go through the gullet, soft and sweet. Turning to actual medieval recipes from the period between about 1380 and 1460, we can see an even more violent vocabulary. On the screen are excerpts for recipes for two really popular meat dishes in this long period, for boucanade, a stew usually made with veal, and a dish called mortrellis, which could be made with any kind of ground meat, but is actually named for the very tool used to make it. Mortrellis means mortar in Latin. And as you can see, just looking at what I've underlined in red on the screen, whether you're making boucanade or mortrellis, you're doing a lot of hewing and hacking. Hew it in small morsels, hew it to gobbets, smite it in pieces, hack it small, and grind it all to dust. I don't want to give you the impression that medieval eaters only ate pureed meat. In fact, meat was often brought to the table roasted, whether in pieces or whole, in which case the animal was often assembled to resemble the living creature it had once been, as is the case in this image of a peacock being brought to a very fancy dinner table. So there were many ways of preparing and presenting food in the Middle Ages, but one thing is for sure, and that is that any smoothness in a dish was the result of quite rough action. And what I want to suggest is that the violence of that action is sonically present in meat-handling verbs as both spoken and read, and even possibly as heard in the mind. Think about the way that the words hack, hew, grind, and smite both sound and even how they feel in your mouth. What I'm referring to here, somewhat elliptically, is what linguists call the Buba-Kiki effect. And this is a phenomenon whereby it has been shown that folks from around the world associate these two nonsense words with both a sense of texture and of taste. And so for many people, the word buba, which is again a nonsense word, connotes the round and the soft, even the sweet, whereas the kiki connotes, again, for most people, something spiky or rough, or when it comes to taste, sour or spicy. Another recent study takes this even further, showing that the phoneme R, that is the sound that we might hear in the word or sound grr, connotes roughness. Keeping all of this in mind, we can turn to another portrait of another pilgrim in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the prioress, and she's the chief nun on the pilgrimage. Scholars have long been interested in the fact that with the prioress, her portrait, that is the description of her at the beginning of the Canterbury Tales, focuses on her very refined manners and her proper behavior. But her tale is a very violent story. It is a miracle tale about the Virgin Mary, but it involves a significant degree of violence because in it, Jews murder a Christian schoolboy. The opening of the prioress's portrait is very focused on her mouth and on orality in general, and she appears to be something of a smooth, even slippery character, something that we get a sense of from all of the S words in the opening description. We learn of her smiling that was simple, her singing that was seemly, and the French that she spoke both fairly and fetously, or elegantly. Further on in the portrait, Chaucer introduces us to the way that she eats, which is also very smooth and very proper. But at the very end of this description of her table manners, Chaucer says, in Middle English, "Full seemly after her meta she rochta." She reached for her food in a very seemly manner, sure, but the word rochta, reached, is one of these R words with a rough texture that in this period, that is the later 14th century, in other literary contexts comes with the connotation of theft and violence. Following upon the description of table manners, Chaucer tells us about the prioress's very tender feelings for animals, and yet the portrait is textured by a significant number of those sounds. The prioress weeps if a mouse is caught in a trap, or if one of the dogs that she feeds with roasted flesh is dead, or if that dog is hit with a sharp stick, a yerda smerta. Right? So what I am suggesting is that in the prologue, we have these words that are implicitly violent about violence done to animals. That is transformed in her tale into explicit violence done to human bodies, both Jewish and Christian. The young Christian boy has his throat cut his throta, again, R words, and the Jews are then executed, their bodies dragged through the street. It is no wonder that for many generations and for many readers, including myself, the prioress and her tale have been difficult to swallow. All of this opens the question of what we should make of Chaucer's cook, and the entirety of his portrait is on the slide. The cook, Chaucer tells us, is an expert at roasting and boiling and broiling and frying, and he's particularly good at making two meat dishes, the mortrellis, here mortreux, that we saw earlier, and another dish called blancmanger, which was a white pudding, but one usually made with some kind of meat. And in between those two dishes, Chaucer tells us that it is a great pity about the cook's own kind of meaty body. He has, Chaucer says, and it's a great shame, an open sore, a mormel, on his shin. Whatever we might make of that, what I hope I've convinced you of in this short talk is that culinary activity and food texture and food language become fundamental aspects of the believability of these characters in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, and that in fact it's in the juxtaposition of rough and smooth texture that we get the impression of character in the first place, perhaps especially unsavory character. Thank you for listening, and if you'd like suggestions for further reading, please don't hesitate to be in touch. Thanks.